Hello and welcome to a quick video on how to join together your UA and your GA4 data. This video is going to be split into three chunks. First, we're going to talk about the why, then we're going to talk about the things to watch out for, and then finally we're going to talk about how to do it in Looker Studio using the default data connectors. So let's hop in. The why I'm going to do really quickly because you probably already know it if you're watching this video. Firstly, year-on-year data. Nice and simple, you work for a big company or a company that's been around for a while. Often this is a requirement for performance reporting. So yeah, you just got to have it. Second one, forecasting. It is often useful to have multiple years as a baseline for seasonality when forecasting, particularly if you have to remove some years because they were weird. Looking at you, 2020 and 2021, which were weird to live in, and they're also weird from a forecasting perspective. Their seasonality is just all out of whack relative to everything else. Finally, having two different profiles, so reconciling your universal analytics with your GA4, is really helpful for finding bugs. For the people that we worked with over at Piped Out, we found that running this process often found bugs in their GA4 setup and sometimes also in their UA setup. Now obviously UA can't be fixed anymore, but GA4 still can. And the crucial thing here was that normally when analytics are wrong, you don't have much to compare it against. It's just, oh, this doesn't feel right. When you had two versions of it, and particularly something that was meant to be really quite similar, looking at exactly where those differences happen was a fantastic way of finding bugs. So we often found running this process helped to improve people's GA4 tracking. Great, so that's the whys out of the way. Now we're going to hop over and we're going to talk into the practicalities of what you should watch out for when you go and do this. Hello and welcome to part 2. So here we're going to be talking about what to watch out for. What we've got here are a series of graphs. We've got GA4 and UA. And we've got GA4 sessions here in this sort of blue line coming down here. And we've got Universal Analytics sessions in this top line here, and these were screenshots from Looker Studio graphs of people where we reconciled this data that's been anonymized. The big thing to sort of note here is that what we care about is the delta, is the difference between the fact that they don't perfectly line up. GA4 and Universal Analytics are not identical. They don't behave exactly the same way. They do have behave very similarly. This is a little bit more of an in-depth topic, and this video is more concerned on the practicalities of joining them than rather exactly all the ways in which they're different. So we have a second video that talks through the whys essentially and how these are different, which will be linked in the description or perhaps at the top. But for this, the practicality that we care about is just how different are they? And there are a couple of things to note here. So the first one is that we often found that across sessions, so we're going to look at three, so sessions, page views, and then revenue and leads. So for sessions, we often found it was sort of between, on average, 4 to 15% different for most people, typically towards the lower end of that bound. For page views and revenue, it was 3 to 8 and 2 to 5 percentage difference, although again, often towards the lower end of that bound. What that practically looks like is something like this, where we can see here there is a consistent, I believe this is a 7% difference between UA and GA4. This is something that you've got to account for if we're going to go and plot our year-on-year traffic or things like that, because if somebody comes to you and says, oh, hey, look, we're up 10% year-on-year, well, you might just have a 10% error margin, so you can't accurately tell that. And we need to attempt to compensate for this as best as we can. The great thing about compensating for this, firstly, is that we found that once it was correctly set up, that this difference stayed consistent over time. So often there's this sort of piece that we can see kind of here and here and here, where we're kind of figuring out how to correctly set up UA and GA4 and how to fix all the different bugs. And once those bugs are fixed, we ended up at a very sort of steady, consistent difference. So that's great. And then we're going to go account for that when we're setting up our dashboard. However, there is one other thing to account for here. So these are just top level numbers, right? These are just sessions with no breakdown, no dimensions. When, of course, we're going to go plot our traffic, we probably don't just care about top level site. We probably care about a channel or a country. Maybe we want to look at organic sessions across the USA and GB. What I'm going to hop over to here is this is a public anonymized report of a dashboard that we essentially, this process that we ran. And we help people with the data side of it. And essentially what we've got here is we've got our GA4 and our Universal Analytics data plotted on the same graph. We've kind of got them together. And then crucially what we've got here are these sort of big tables. So we pick a dimension, in this case it's country. We then plot for a period, the total number of GA4 sessions that we got there, the total number of UA sessions, and the percentage relative breakdown. And this is the one that's really important. So we can see that France, for example, got 20% of GA4 traffic and 27% of UA traffic. The relative difference there is 0. That's fantastic news for the purposes of reconciling these and, for example, plotting year-on-year UK and US or France data. They essentially didn't change very much. And what we broadly found is that when people had set up their UA and their GA4 correctly, most of these dimensions had between a 0 and 1% relative difference, i.e. the breakdown across things was very, very similar. If it ended up being more than that, it was often due to some sort of bug. If it is more different, for example, we can see down in the channel groupings, there's some differences here, I believe in this case in this set of anonymized data from channel grouping configurations. One thing that we'll want to do is, our top level number might be 7% difference, let's say, and then we can go, okay, but within referral we have this additional 6% that we have to compensate for. And so we can kind of click into here, calculate, and essentially see our relative difference. And this is the process that you're going to end up wanting to run here, right? The process is going to look like, take your UA and GA4 data, join them together so you get them over a graph, and then also join them together and put them on tables, get this percentage breakdown, and calculate the relative difference. These numbers here are all pulled through from BigQuery, so you can't directly just go and copy this template, but this should be hopefully a good inspiration of the type of setup that you want to build, and I think most of this is possible within the default connector, although you might need to export it to Excel and just calculate, for example, some columns like this. So that's the reconciliation process, right, and what to watch out for. The primary thing that we're looking for is basically to figure out how different are these numbers and how different are they across the dimensions that we care about. If we find that they are very different, right, if we find that we have something sort of more like this, where our numbers are wildly different, the process that we want to run is we want to basically join our two data anyway, then compare them across dimensions. We typically found that most specific dimensions, things like country, device, medium and source rather than channel grouping, page path, browser version, all of this was a great way to discover essentially where there were inconsistencies in the tracking. And once we'd hammered all of this out, what we ended up with was a consistent difference between GA4 and UA, and we know the number that we have to compensate for and whether or not there is any additional compensations within the dimensions that we're looking to plot at. So that's part 2. Now we're going to roll on to part 3, where we're then going to talk through practically how do you go and do this in Looker Studio, now knowing what we know. Hello and welcome to part 3. Now we're going to talk through actually joining together our GA4 and UA practically in Looker Studio using the default connector. So how do we do that? Firstly, we pop into resource. We go manage added data sources. I've already made a report here. You obviously want to make a report. And that's then we're going to hit add new data source and we're going to see this open up. In this case, we're going to connect to data. It's always Google Analytics. And then once you've gone into it, you're then going to see all the different properties you have access to. Some of them should be UA, i.e. they begin with UNA, and then some of them should be GA4, they'll begin with GA4. We want to make sure we've picked the two which are going to map over and add both of those. Once you've added them both over, we're going to pop back into here and we're going to go into Resource, Manage Blends. Into here and we're going to add a blend. It will then pop open like this. We're going to add in some tables. So we're going to add, I've added GA4 on the left-hand side and UA on the right-hand side, but the order of these doesn't matter. What does matter here is then picking in the dimensions that we want. So for this default example, I've just picked date, but we might want to pick some other ones. We want to pick medium, we want to pick country, things like that. We're then going to pick the metrics that we want here. So we've got views here and page views over here. They sometimes have slightly different names between the two of them, but they're typically pretty similar and you can just guess them, or you can at least Google if you're not 100% sure. For 90% of people, views and page views will be exactly the same, unless you have apps or something like that. So we've got both of these set up here. We're going to add in any other dimensions. We're going to make sure that they're added, all of our dimensions are added to both sides. Once we've done that, we hit this join condition in the middle, and we're going to hit full outer join. Then we're going to make sure that every dimension that we've added on both sides here is added to both sides of this join. So date on one side, date on the other side, medium on one side, medium on the other side. We're going to add them all in and save it. We're going to make sure there are absolutely no blues and that we have all of our dimensions here and that they're all there on both sides. We'll save that and then hop back in now with our blend. Now we've got our blend. I would typically just make a chart with the blend. So we'll click the same, we'll make a chart, we'll hit for the source of the managed blended data, pick the managed blended data here, And then I'll typically just plot like date 1, the GA4 date or something like that, and then plot views and page views just to see what we've got. And we see something, hooray, about what we're looking for. We see that consistent difference that we talked about earlier on, and we can see the two of them there. So the first step that we'll go on here is you might have some gaps in your date range depending on how your tracking went. So we'll usually go into here and we will add, I'll click on this instead, and we'll click add field, and then we'll do date. And it's usually good practice here to put in, if you're joining the two of them, to put in UA plus GA4, just so it's pretty clear to anyone who comes back what's going on here. We're going to use the formula coalesce, which essentially says merge these two things together. And then we're going to put in our dates. So we're going to put in date 1, and we're going to put in date 2. Again, the order of this doesn't matter. So those are both of our dates from either side of our blend. Great, and you would want to do this with all of the dimensions that you're plotting up here. So if you're doing it with medium, if you're doing whatever, you'd always want to blend the two of these here. Great, so now we've got the two things that are joined together. Again, in my case, this hasn't changed it, but it might for yours. It will just fill in some of those gaps. Then what we're going to do is we're just going to figure out the number that we need to shift this, or the one that we've already got written down earlier. So typically what I'll go and do in here is I'll add a column and I'll add a new field. In this case, I've called it just GA4 altered. So I've taken views and I've multiplied views by the difference, the consistent difference between the two of these. In this case, it's about 6%. What we can see here is that now GA4 altered views, we should probably put views at the beginning of there, just so that's a little bit clearer as to what's going on. We can now see that we've got our views and our page views almost perfectly overlap. And it's going to be far, far easier for us to sort of, it's not perfect. We can see there's a couple fractional differences there, but it's pretty damn close now. And it certainly will be a lot better for year-on-year reporting and making sure we're showing consistent numbers. So we figured out our numbers, we figured out the other bit. The final thing that we have to do is to then make sure that we have both these plotted on the same graph. And what we want to do here is we want to pick a point for switchover. So pick a date. So if we come back to over here and we come back to our date, we, for example, do not want to pick here as the switchover date, right? The numbers are still not the same. We want to pick something more around here, typically something more towards the June time in this particular case, or here almost exactly around June time is where we want to pick. So we're going to pick that date, and then we're going to go in here and make a formula that combines the two of these. This formula will be written out in the blog post, which is what I would suggest just going and copying it from rather than trying to read it off what I'm doing here. But to essentially explain it here, what we've got is we have, and we can sort of read this inside out. First, we have this same joining of date here. So we've taken the two dates and we've then said if the date is greater than this other date, so this is the switchover date that we've selected, in this case the 1st of June, I would like you to pick views, which is the GA4 number. Otherwise, I would like you to pick page views, because we can see this whole thing is wrapped in an if. And then at that point, we have the two numbers now nicely plotted together over here on a graph, ready for our year-on-year reporting and all of that good stuff. We could also at this point take our blend, and if we had multiple dimensions, we could add them to a table, add in page views here, and we would move towards building out these tables if we needed to go and run that reconciliation process that we talked about otherwise. Okay, so bonus segment. This method is going to probably stop working about midway through this year and just break. This occurred to me as I was editing this video, as I realized that, of course, well, Universal Analytics has stopped processing data. They've finally now given us a date for when they're going to go and delete all of it, which is the 1st of July 2024. If you're just joining with the native connector over here, I think there's a pretty good chance at that point that this will just break. They might delete the front end and leave the data behind so you can access it through it, but I think that is incredibly unlikely and it's probably just gone. So how do you get around that? The way that you're going to have to do it is you're going to have to download that data and back it up and put it somewhere else. The easiest and the latest version of this is going to be to use the Google Analytics spreadsheet add-on to download it into a spreadsheet, add a spreadsheet as a source to Looker Studio, and then join that with the data and do the same process that we followed in the video. But you will use the spreadsheet version of data rather than the Looker Studio source. If you have too much data, what you're going to to kind of handle the spreadsheet, you're going to want to use something. Instead, you're going to want to use a data warehouse. You're probably going to want to use something like BigQuery. If that's the case, that's a little bit more to get into here because you have to download it all from the API and then load it into BigQuery. And then once you've done that, you can again join through BigQuery through the source lake here. Although, of course, if it is in BigQuery, you have some better versions that will reduce the amount of work in Looker Studio. You can actually just join all of this in BigQuery, and then you won't need to touch any of this in Looker Studio. If that is the case and you would like help and you have too much data and you'd like help with the BigQuery version, please get in touch with us. That is what we do. We're a small team and a small remote team at Piped Out, and we help people with exactly this sort of problems. So we can back up all of your data into BigQuery, and we can give you these combined views so you can skip all of this process in Looker Studio as well. If you're just small and you'd like to just kind of get at it yourself, I'd highly recommend using the Google Analytics spreadsheet add-on. I'll leave that in the description for this video, and you can just download it to a spreadsheet and do that version in lieu. So yes, that's a little bit quick add-on on the end of this video. Hope your day is going well. Okay, so that's pretty much a wrap. I think the real big thing to take away from that is that the hardest and most important part of that is the reconciliation bit. So essentially making sure that your UA and your GA4 data can be tied together year on year without a massive margin for error, and sort of removing and reducing that. We'd highly recommend running the reconciliation process. Obviously at this point you can no longer fix UA, and you also won't have live UA and GA4 data overlapping each other. So you are a little bit more limited in what you can get out of it. However, we've absolutely still seen people run this, and they've run it sort of like 4 or 5 months, 6 months post when they kind of set up their UA and GA4 together. And the bugs that we then found from doing it were bugs that had existed for those entire 6 months, essentially. Because they hadn't gone and compared the two of things, they discovered some things that were missing, and they had never been fixed across the time period. So it is entirely possible that by running this, you still discover some bugs that you can go and fix. Or, ideal world, you just discover a nice, consistent difference. There aren't any bugs, and you go, great, I can just account for this in my year-on-year reporting, and I've got helpful year-on-year numbers. If you'd like help with any of this, we're a small remote team over at Piped Out. We help SEO and marketing teams with sort of data problems, things like this. We've got loads of experience with data warehouses, analytics, all that sort of good stuff. So please reach out to us and give us a shout. If not, and you're just going through this by yourself, hopefully this has been helpful in talking to you how to do that. And yeah, we'll see you next time.